Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about mistakes that chess beginners always make. And I'm saying always, I'm saying like in your next game, if you don't see, if you don't watch this video, in the next game you're going to make some of these mistakes. I'm serious. So yeah, 7 mistakes chess beginners always make. Let's talk about that. So the first mistake I want to highlight is it happens in situations like this one. Very often we play some knight g5, they castle, and it's extremely tempting for beginners this kind of capture because we're going to get a rook out of this. So this looks like a good thing. I'm getting a rook. This is great. But the thing is that you're losing two minor pieces, the knight and the bishop, and very often the knight and the bishop are going to be better than the rook, especially in this situation. Even when you're getting also a pawn, so you get the rook and the pawn, even when they are both 6 points, the rook and the pawn 6 and the knight and the bishop 6, it's still a bad thing. The main reason why this is a bad thing is because your knight and your bishop are active pieces, and the rook are the pawn, and the rook, maybe the pawn, but especially the rook is doing nothing right now. So basically, you're trading two active pieces for a passive piece, and also basically after the trade of these pieces, your opponent will have many pieces already developed and active, as your pieces will be extremely passive on the other side. So that's the main reason this is a bad idea. So whenever you can do this, trading your knight and your bishop active pieces for the rook and also maybe for the pawn, it's not really going to work. In general, it's going to be a bad idea. It's extremely tempting, but it's not good. So this is not good because this position is actually totally okay for black. Mistake number 2, I'm going to talk about not trading pieces properly, and here I'm going to talk about handling trades, using trades as a weapon. This is something that takes some time, takes some experience, so it's not really easy. It's a little complicated, but basically you should know that in some situations you're going to trade and it's going to be good for you, and in some situations you're going to avoid trades because it's going to be good for your opponent. So basically you're trying to identify those moments and know when it's good for you and trade or not depending on the situation. So I'm going to give you some examples so you get the idea. If you have material advantage, of course you want to trade. That's, I guess, is very well known, but also it's a very common mistake. So we should still talk about it. Um, Trade pieces when you have material advantage. Don't trade when you have material disadvantage. That's extremely important. You need to use it in your games. If you have one pawn up, you can already trade pieces, and you should already trade pieces. If you have more than one pawn, of course, even more, you should trade pieces. So, you know, something simple, situation like this, you have an extra pawn, you can trade and fight for the file, for example. This is good for you, and you can handle the situation that way. If you're playing with black, well, then you should try to avoid trades. Let's say a situation like this one, it is black to move, avoid trades. Put your queen on e7 or something, but don't trade queens because you need to stay in the middle game, avoid the endgame. In the endgame, with the advantage, your opponent is going to win the game. So that's a situation where you want to avoid or trade or force trades when we have material advantage or disadvantage, but this is not the only reason. There are other things to keep in mind. For example, if you have material, space advantage, then you're going to want to avoid trades because you have, a lot of space. On the other side, if your opponent has space disadvantage, he's going to need to trade pieces. The main reason for this is that you have a lot of space and you can, move pieces very easily with that much of a space. I'm going to show you, I know, let's say some situation like this one. You have a lot of space. It's very easy for you to move pieces, right? You can move your queen, your knight, your bishop as you want. You don't have a problem with the space. So in this situation, you are not going to trade pieces. You're fine. You can handle pieces in that space. All good. But look at your opponent. Your opponent has some trouble, right? They have short space, very little space there, and they need to make pieces play, a lot of pieces play in such a short space. So that's like a problem. So that's another reason to trade or not. Keep in mind the space, the control and the space in the position. And also other things to keep in mind, for example, development and activity. So, for example, let's talk about a position like I don't know, another example like let's say like this, where you are ahead in development and you have much more activity. In a situation like this, you don't want to trade pieces, you are more active. So basically you want to stay in the middle game, create problems, create threats. On the other side, your opponent is going to try the opposite. He wants to trade pieces to avoid complications, to avoid attacks. So that's also a situation where we can handle trades conveniently. So I just mentioned three situations where trades are very important, either trading or not, depending on the position, like according to the material, according to the space, and according to the development and activity. Keep that in mind in your own games because it's going to be very important and decisive in some situations. Another thing we should talk about is about castling. It's a very common mistake among beginners, and it is which is the right moment to castle. So let's talk about that a little. Very often, you want to castle as soon as possible. So that's the rule. Just castle as soon as possible. That's what the principle states. The principle does not state castle whenever you feel danger or castle when you think there is some risk. That's not what the principle states. The principle states castle as soon as possible. So, whenever you can, just castle. Even if you feel safe, you should try to castle. If not, you can regret because there might be a check. There might be some piece controlling some square and you cannot castle after that. And things like that. So again, castle as soon as possible and it's going to be helpful for you and for your position. Mistake number 4 that chess beginners always make is playing too many pawn moves. I know it's very tempting. Sometimes we play, a pawn move over here to reinforce the center, a pawn move over here to develop the bishop, another one to develop the bishop over there as well. Then we think we want to get some space over there. We play this. Sometimes we can also play like, I don't know, f3 to reinforce here and control here. And it looks tempting, it looks good at some point, but it's not really a good idea. Try to not move many pawns, just play the essential pawn moves in the opening. Keep in mind that the pawn is a very special piece. The pawn is the only piece that cannot go back. So once you move the pawn, it cannot move back, which means that if it's not good or if something changes in the position, you cannot fix it. For example, you move a bishop and then something changes, you want to go back, you can go back, or you regret or you realize it's not really a good move, you can still go back. So that's something you can do with a bishop, with a rook, or with a queen. But with the pawn, you must be totally sure that it's a move that you need to play, because once you play it, you cannot go back. And also, I'm talking about the castling. Very often we are going to castle, and we are going to think about moving those pawns, right? It's extremely common among beginners, but actually, in most cases, it's not really going to be fine. In general, a good rule is don't move those pawns in front of your king. Very often, in some positions, very often we should say the move h3 is going to be okay because the pin is actually annoying. It's actually a problem. So h3 is probably fine in many situations. Not always, but in many situations it's going to be okay. Other than that, most pawn moves around your king are going to be wrong. So in general, it's like the last resource. You're going to move the pawn in front of the king in the castling. It's because it's the last resource. It's the last thing you can do to fix or defend something. But just try to avoid it as much as possible because it's just going to create more weaknesses. It's going to create more problems than solutions. So yeah, that's extremely important and it's a very common mistake among beginners. I think we should continue with the next mistake, and it is developing the queen too early. And again, this is something we have already mentioned a lot, but well, it's still a very common mistake, and it is that this kind of moves, I know they are going to work a lot at the beginning, right? Among beginners, among players that are just starting, it's going to work at some point, but there will be a moment where it's not going to work anymore, where you're going to be losing more games than winning because of this. So in general, you should know that it's not fine, it's not good, and it's not a good strategy if you're planning to, improve. If you're planning a long-term improvement, it's not the right strategy. So the main problem is that if he defends against the threat, then your queen is going to be a target, and it's going to develop, improve by attacking your queen, and uh, it's going to be actually better for your opponent. If they can handle the situation correctly, it's going to be better for your opponent. So the rule or the principle states, do not develop the queen early in the opening. That's a good idea. Well, we should talk about the next principle, and it is not a. I mean, I said principle. I meant the next mistake, and it is not improving major pieces in the middle game. So let's work with an example. Let's say we have a position, a random position like, I don't know, this one, again, an Italian here. So let's say we have something like this. Let's develop the bishop as well, and we can also trade it, for example. And I'm talking about not improving major pieces in the middle game. Let's talk about that a little. We have already mentioned how in the opening we should not develop the queen or the rooks either. Of course, the rooks are very hard to develop, so you won't develop the rooks even if you want, in general. But, well, in general, you should not develop major pieces in the opening. We don't need them. In the opening, we need the minor pieces. They are very quick. They are very fast pieces, very light, and they can help a lot at the beginning. So that's what we do in the opening. We develop minor pieces. But in the middle game, we should focus on major pieces, right? You're going to need those pieces. Those are the most powerful pieces. So the middle game is the right phase of the game to improve those pieces. So what's the idea? Once you get into the middle game, you're going to improve your queen a little, and you're going to improve your rooks also a little. What's the strategy for the queen, and what's the strategy for the rooks? In general, you're going to move the queen. Pay attention, it's extremely important. To squares where the queen is active and safe. Both things. You're going to need both things for your queen. As active and as safe as possible. That's the strategy. Keep in mind that the way you handle your queen is extremely important because it's your most decisive piece. I mean, your most powerful piece. Many games are decided by blunders with queen moves, either because you were winning and you didn't see the queen move winning the game, you just missed the win, or because you just moved the queen, blundering the queen, missing a fork, or just hanging the queen over there. So this means that the way you move your queen, if you learn to handle your queen properly, is decisive. It can change a lot of things. So try to follow this strategy when you're playing. Move your queen to squares where it is both safe and active. For example, a square like e2 is more or less fine for the queen because the queen is safe, it's not really a target for any enemy piece, and it's a little more active than on d1. Or we can also say, for example, d2. Again, it's super safe and is more active than it was on d1. You're controlling more squares over here, and you are controlling more squares over here. So try to follow that strategy for the queen, safe and active. For the rooks, we're going to follow another strategy. You try to put the rooks in open or half open files. For example, in this position, let's open this file, the B file. So in this position, a good square for the rook is B1, right? The B file is an open file, so that's what you should do with your rooks. Put them on open files. Also, you can use the half open file D for the other rook. So maybe a rook on B, a rook on D is going to be a good idea. Also for black, B is a good position for the rook, and F, this is a half open file for black, so they can try to put the rook there. In some positions, there won't be open or half open files, and then you might be thinking, well, what do we do in those situations? In general, when there are no open or half open files, you can put your rooks in the central files behind your central pawns. For example, very often the rook on e1 is going to be okay, supporting that pawn because there might be breaks or something later. So the rooks are going to be fine in the central files behind your advanced central pawns. Try to follow that. I think it's going to be really helpful for your middle games. And finally, I'm going to talk about a common mistake number 7. I can tell you it happens a lot, and it can change a lot of things if you learn to handle this one. And it is about the endgame and the king. In the endgame, your king is going to be a decisive piece. So basically, you need to activate your king in the endgame. That's a rule. That's a principle. Again, very common mistake, right? We just uh, don't see it a lot. We miss it a lot in games. So that's the thing. Once you are in the end game, there's no checkmate threat. So in the end game, you should use your king. Keep in mind, if there's no checkmate threat, the game is going to be a piece, like a minor piece. For example, like a knight or like a bishop. Just activate it. Um, use the king to protect your own pawns. Use the king to attack enemy pawns. Things like that. Because it's going to help you. It's another piece in the attack. You cannot just stay there not using and your opponent using the king. He's going to have the advantage. Basically, the main problem with this idea is that it's not so easy to find the limit between positions where there is checkmate threat and there's no checkmate threat. So it's not so easy to determine when we are ready to advance the king and use it in the endgame because there's no checkmate threat, there's no danger, and we can actually use the king. There's nothing to worry about. And situations where it's extremely dangerous and you're just making your king more exposed. It's not so easy to find that moment. It's not so easy to find that point, and that I guess that's what makes it harder. And I guess that's also what makes it a very common mistake among beginners. But hopefully, after talking about it, you will think about it a little more in your games. Remember, your king is like a knight or like a bishop. Once there is no checkmate threat, you should use it to take enemy pawns to protect your own pawns. So thank you so much, guys. I hope these tips or analysis about common mistakes has been helpful, and hopefully in next games you won't make either, or at least not many, of these 7 common mistakes among beginners. Thank you so much. Like, subscribe, and we'll catch you guys in the next.